Hey everyone. Gather round because I've got a story that'll make your hair stand on end. Seriously, this one time, something really spooky happened to me. It's a true story and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any scary adventure, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and trust me, you don't want to miss this. It all started with a car, and believe me, it wasn't just any car. Oh, and before I forget, I have something really special for you guys. Make sure to click the link in the description below to learn more. You won't regret it. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's get started. It all began when I needed a new car. My old one had finally given up the ghost. Ironic, right? I didn't have a lot of money, so I decided to check out an auction. You know, where they sell used stuff. I'd never been to one before and it was kind of exciting. Lots of people, lots of noise, and lots of cars, all lined up waiting for a new owner. I walked around looking for something that looked okay and didn't cost too much. There were rusty trucks, dented vans, and cars with ripped seats. Finally, I spotted it. A dark blue sedan, a little older, but it looked clean and like it was in pretty good shape. I peeked inside. The seats were a bit worn, but not too bad. The steering wheel felt good in my hands. This could work, I thought. The auctioneer started talking really fast, calling out numbers and trying to get people to bid. I waited for the blue car to come up. When it did, the bidding started low. I jumped in, raising my hand. A few other people bid, but I kept going, a little higher each time. Finally, the auctioneer banged his hammer and shouted, "Sold to the gentleman in the back." That was me. I was now the proud owner of a used, dark blue sedan. I paid for the car, got the keys, and walked out to the parking lot. It looked even better in the sunlight. I got in, turned the key, and the engine started right up. Yes, I said to myself. This is going to be great. I drove it home, feeling happy with my purchase. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and it ran well. The first few days were fine. I drove to work, went to the store, and visited friends. The car was comfortable, and I didn't have any problems. But then things started to get weird. It started with the temperature. Sometimes when I was driving, I'd feel a sudden cold spot, like someone had opened a window. But all the windows were closed. It would just be a quick chill, then it would go away. I thought maybe it was just the air conditioning acting up, even though I didn't have it on. Then I started hearing noises. Little taps and bumps like someone was knocking on the dashboard. Or a faint whisper like someone was trying to talk to me, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I turned up the radio to drown out the sounds, thinking it was just my imagination. Maybe the car was just old and needed some work. One evening, I was driving home from work. It was getting dark and the street lights were just coming on. I glanced in the rearview mirror and that's when I saw it. Just for a split second, I saw a dark shape in the back seat. It looked like a person, but it was shadowy and indistinct. I blinked and it was gone. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding. What was that? I muttered to myself. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew I had seen something. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I started avoiding driving at night. But even during the day, the strange occurrences continued. The cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It was like something was in the car with me. Something unseen, but definitely there. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But it was getting harder and harder. I started feeling anxious and scared every time I got in the car. I dreaded driving, but I needed the car to get to work and do errands. I was trapped. One afternoon, I was driving to the grocery store. The sun was shining and I was trying to stay positive. It's just a car, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But as I turned a corner, I heard a loud bang from the back seat. It sounded like someone had slammed their fist against the seat. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The back seat was empty. Okay, this is getting out of hand, I said aloud, my voice shaking. I decided to do some investigating. Maybe I could find out something about the car's history, something that would explain what was happening. I went to the Department of Motor Vehicles and asked them to look up the car's previous owners. It took a while, but they finally gave me the information. The car had been owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. She had lived in a small town about an hour away. I decided to drive to the town and see if I could find anyone who knew her. Maybe they could tell me something about the car, something that would explain the strange things that were happening. I drove to the town the next day. It was a quiet, peaceful place with tree-lined streets and friendly people. I stopped at a local coffee shop and asked the woman behind the counter if she knew Mrs. Ainsworth. "Oh yes," she said. Everyone knew Eleanor. She was a sweet old lady. She lived in that little blue house on Elm Street. "Do you know what happened to her?" I asked. The The woman's face turned sad. She passed away a few months ago. It was very sudden. She was driving her car, that old blue sedan, and she had a heart attack. She crashed into a tree. It was a terrible tragedy. My blood ran cold. Was she killed instantly? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, the woman said. She didn't suffer. But it was still a shock to everyone. She was such a lovely woman. I thanked the woman and left the coffee shop. I walked back to my car, feeling sick to my stomach. Mrs. Ainsworth had died in this car. Could that be why it was haunted? Was her spirit still trapped inside? I drove to Elm Street and found the little blue house. It was empty and overgrown with weeds. The windows were dark and lifeless. I could feel a coldness emanating from the house, a sense of sadness and loss. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house. Then I noticed something in the front yard. A small wooden cross, half hidden in the grass. I walked over to it and knelt down. The cross was old and weathered, but I could still make out the inscription, Eleanor Ainsworth, beloved mother and friend. I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer for Mrs. Ainsworth. I asked her to find peace and to move on. I told her that I would take care of her car and that I would never forget her. When I opened my eyes, I felt a little better. The coldness around me had lessened, and I felt a sense of calm. Maybe, just maybe, I had made a connection with Mrs. Ainsworth's spirit. I got back in the car and started driving home. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And that's when I saw it again. The shadowy figure in the back seat. But this time it was clearer. I could see the outline of a woman, an elderly woman with gray hair and a kind face. She was smiling at me. I gasped and looked away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I looked back, the figure was gone. But I knew what I had seen. It was Mrs. Ainsworth. And she wasn't angry or scary. She was just there. The strange occurrences in the car didn't stop completely after that. But they were different. The cold spots were less frequent, the whispers were softer, and the shadowy figure only appeared occasionally. It was like Mrs. Ainsworth was still there, but she wasn't trying to scare me. She was just watching over me. I started talking to her when I was driving. I would tell her about my day, about my work, about my friends. I would tell her about my hopes and dreams. And I felt like she was listening. Like she was there, sharing my life with me. One day I was driving to work and I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it. But I did. And I understood what it said. Thank you, the whisper said. I smiled. You're welcome, Mrs. Ainsworth, I said aloud. And then something amazing happened. The car started to glow. Not a bright, blinding light, but a soft, warm glow that filled the entire car. It was a beautiful, peaceful feeling. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the glow faded away. I never saw Mrs. Ainsworth again after that. The strange occurrences in the car stopped completely. It was like she had finally found peace and moved on. But I will never forget her. And I will always be grateful for the time we shared in that old, dark blue sedan. I still have the car. I know it sounds crazy, right? But I can't bring myself to get rid of it. It's more than just a car to me. It's a reminder of Mrs. Ainsworth, and of the time I encountered something truly extraordinary. Something that changed my life forever. I did say I have something special for you guys. Make sure you click the link in the description below to learn more. But the story doesn't end there. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I still feel a presence in the car with me. A sense of warmth and peace. And I know that Mrs. Ainsworth is still there, watching over me, making sure I'm safe. The other day I took a drive down to Elm Street to visit the house and to pay my respect to where she passed away. I parked the car in front of the house and I got out and walked to the area. I saw the cross but I couldn't find it. I looked all over but it was nowhere to be seen. I got back in the car and drove off. All of a sudden I heard a whisper saying, "Thank you for everything." The hair on my skin crawled up my body. I stepped on the gas and drove off, but when I glanced at the rearview mirror, I almost got into an accident. I pulled over to the side and stared into the rearview mirror with so much fright. I saw her, Mrs. Ainsworth, staring at me. But this time she wasn't smiling at me. She had a stern look on her face. She had a stern look on her face. I almost drove off the road. What did I do wrong? Why is she staring at me like that? I was so scared I almost lost control of the car. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Mrs. Ainsworth?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Is that you? What's wrong?" The image in the mirror didn't change. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and her expression was hard. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. This wasn't the gentle, grateful spirit I thought I knew. This was something else entirely. Something angry. I slowly put the car in gear and started driving again, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Mrs. Ainsworth's image remained there, unwavering. The air in the car grew cold and I felt a pressure in my chest like I was being suffocated. The radio started flickering, the static growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. I reached out and slammed the radio off, but the static continued, filling the car with a horrible, grating noise. I felt like my head was going to explode. I glanced back at the mirror again and Mrs. Ainsworth's face was getting closer, her eyes burning into mine. Her mouth opened and she started to speak, but it wasn't her voice. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice rasped. I swerved the car, trying to get away from the image in the mirror, but it was no use. Her face was still there, still getting closer, her eyes filled with hate. I felt a sharp pain in my head and I realized she was inside my mind, invading my thoughts. I tried to block her out, to push her away, but she was too strong. She was taking over. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to fight her. But it was no use. She was in control. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel, and I realized I wasn't driving anymore. She was. I opened my eyes and saw that the car was speeding down the road, faster and faster. We were heading straight for a sharp curve, and I knew we weren't going to make it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, watching as we hurtled towards disaster. I braced myself for the impact, knowing that this was the end. But then, at the last possible second, the car swerved, narrowly missing the curve. We were still on the road, but we were heading in the wrong direction, back towards the house on Elm Street. I struggled to regain control, to fight Mrs. Ainsworth's influence, but it was no use. She was too strong. She was driving me back to her house, back to the place where she had died. What did she want? What was she planning? As we approached the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the front yard, next to the empty space where the cross had been, was a figure. A shadowy figure, but I could see it clearly. It was Mrs. Ainsworth, and she was smiling. The car pulled into the driveway and stopped right in front of her. I felt a jolt, like I was being ejected from my own body. And then everything went black. I woke up lying on the ground next to the car. The sun was setting and the sky was a deep orange color. I felt disoriented and confused. What had happened? Where was I? I looked around and saw the house on Elm Street. I remembered everything then. Mrs. Ainsworth, the ghostly image in the mirror, the drive back to the house. It had all been real. I stood up, feeling weak and shaky. The car was parked in the driveway, the engine off. I walked over to it and looked inside. The keys were still in the ignition. I reached in and grabbed them, my hand trembling. I turned around and looked at the house. Mrs. Ainsworth was gone. The front yard was empty. But I could still feel her presence, watching me, waiting. I knew she wasn't finished with me yet. I stumbled away from the car and started walking down the road, away from the house, away from Mrs. Ainsworth. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I had to escape her grasp. I walked for hours until I reached a small town. I found a motel and checked in, collapsing on the bed in exhaustion. I was safe for now, but I knew it wouldn't last. Mrs. Ainsworth was still out there, and she would find me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. How could I stop her? How could I break free from her curse? I had to find a way, or she would destroy me. I could not understand this. I have done everything to keep her at peace. I could not understand this. I have done everything to keep her at peace. Why is she still haunting me? Is there something more she wants? Or am I just a plaything for her twisted, ghostly amusement? Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the motel room, every passing car outside my window, sent shivers down my spine. I kept imagining Mrs. Ainsworth's face in the rearview mirror, her eyes burning with that hateful intensity. The next morning, I decided I couldn't run anymore. I had to face her. But how? I needed to. Find out more about her life, about what happened in that house, about why she was so angry. Maybe there was something I could do to finally set her free. I started by going to the local library. It was a small, quiet place filled with the scent of old books. I spent hours searching through old newspapers and town records, looking for any mention of Eleanor Ainsworth. I found some articles about her life. She was a beloved member of the community, a dedicated volunteer, and a kind neighbor. But there was nothing about any tragedy, any secret, any reason for her to be so tormented. As I was about to give up, I stumbled upon a small, faded article about the accident. It mentioned that Mrs. Ainsworth had been on her way to visit her sister in a nearby town when she had the heart attack. It also mentioned that her sister had been waiting for her at a local nursing home. I decided to go there. Maybe her sister knew something. The nursing home was a depressing place, filled with the sounds of coughing and the smell of disinfectant. I found Mrs. Ainsworth's sister, Martha, in a small, dimly lit room. She was an old woman, frail and confused. At first, she didn't recognize her sister's name. But when I showed her a picture of Eleanor, her eyes lit up. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My sweet Eleanor. Is she here?" I hesitated, not knowing how to tell her the truth. She can't be here, Martha. But I need to ask you something. Do you know why she was so upset before the accident?" Martha looked confused. "Upset?" Eleanor was never upset. She was always so happy, so full of life. "But something must have happened," I insisted. "Something that made her angry." Martha thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Well," she said slowly, "there was one thing. A few days before she died, Eleanor told me she had found something in the house. Something that belonged to our mother." "What was it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "It was an old box," Martha said, "filled with letters and photographs. Eleanor said they were very upsetting. She wouldn't tell me what was in them, but she was very agitated afterwards." "Do you know where this box is now?" I asked. Martha shook her head. "No. Eleanor took it with her when she left. I don't know what happened to it." The box. That had to be it. Whatever was in that box was the key to Mrs. Ainsworth's anger, the reason she was still haunting me. I had to find it. But where? I had no idea where to even begin looking. I thanked Martha and left the nursing home, feeling more confused and frustrated than ever. I had a clue, but it was just out of reach. I drove back to the motel, my mind racing. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Standing next to my car was the dark blue sedan. The car I had bought at auction. The car that was haunted by Mrs. Ainsworth. And sitting inside in the driver's seat was a shadowy figure. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it was her. Mrs. Ainsworth. She had found me. And she was waiting. The only question was, what did she want to do with me now? I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to slowly approach the car. As I got closer and closer, I started to hear the engine start. But it was making some weird noises. Then I noticed that the glass windows were starting to turn black slowly. I didn't understand what was going on, and as I got closer I realized I was moving towards the car on my own without my permission. It was like I was under some kind of spell. This can't be good. This can't be good. My feet moved faster, like I was being reeled in by an invisible line. The car's engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, the sound echoing ominously in the otherwise quiet parking lot. The blackness spreading across the windows was like ink bleeding into water, obscuring the interior, making it impossible to see who or what was inside. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat, a silent plea lost in the growing dread that consumed me. I fought against the pull, digging my heels into the asphalt, but it was no use. The force was too strong, too relentless. As I reached the car, the driver's side door swung open with a creak that sounded like a bone snapping. A gust of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. I could feel Mrs. Ainsworth's presence, cold and malevolent, wrapping around me like a shroud. A voice, raspy and distorted, echoed from the depths of the car. "Get in," it hissed. "We have unfinished business." I knew I should run, that every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn and flee. But I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. My legs moved on their own, lifting me into the car, into the darkness. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a death knell. The car lurched forward, tires screeching, throwing me back against the seat. The world outside the blacked-out windows was a blur, a distorted landscape of fear and uncertainty. I tried to look over at the driver, but all I could see was a shadowy figure, its features obscured by the darkness. The air inside the car was thick with a suffocating presence, and the smell of decay grew stronger, making me gag. "Where are you taking me?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. The car sped on, faster and faster, hurtling down the highway like a possessed machine. The static on the radio returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of noise that grated on my nerves. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and images flashed through my mind. The house on Elm Street, the wooden cross, Mrs. Ainsworth's face in the rearview mirror, twisted with rage. I realized then that she wasn't just haunting me. She was trying to take over, to possess me completely. She wanted to use my body to finish whatever unfinished business she had left behind. But what was it? What was so important that she was willing to torment me, to drag me into her own personal hell? I closed my eyes, trying to block out the noise, the images, the suffocating presence. I had to fight back to find some way to break free from her control. But how? I was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a vengeful spirit. Suddenly, the car swerved violently, throwing me against the door. I opened my eyes and saw that we were no longer on the highway. We were on a narrow, winding road, surrounded by trees. The road was dark and overgrown, barely visible in the fading light. "Where are we going?" I asked again, my voice desperate. The figure finally spoke, its voice a chilling whisper. "We're going home," it said. "Back to where it all began." I knew then that we were heading back to the house on Elm Street. Back to the place where Mrs. Ainsworth had died. Back to the place where her secrets were buried. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I was about to uncover something terrible. Something that would change my life forever. As we pulled up to the house, I noticed there was another car parked in the driveway. This wasn't any ordinary car. It looked abandoned and had plants growing all over. It almost looked as if it has been there for years. I got chills down my spine and started to prepare myself for the worst. What am I about to get into? What am I about to get into? My heart hammered against my ribs as the car lurched to a stop behind the overgrown vehicle. The shadowy figure beside me remained silent, its presence radiating an unnerving calm that only amplified my fear. The house loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky, its windows like vacant. Eyes staring into my soul. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I could feel Mrs. Ainsworth's energy pulsing around me, a mixture of anger, despair, and a desperate need for something I couldn't yet understand. The figure finally stirred, its hand reaching out to open the car door. "We're here," it whispered, its voice a chilling rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "It's time to face the truth." I hesitated, my feet rooted to the floor. I didn't want to get out of the car, didn't want to step into that house, didn't want to confront whatever horrors awaited me inside. But I knew I had no choice. Mrs. Ainsworth had brought me here for a reason, and I couldn't escape her grasp until I fulfilled her purpose. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The figure followed close behind, its presence a constant reminder of the danger I was in. Together, we walked towards the house, the overgrown grass crunching beneath our feet. As we reached the front porch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratched into the wooden railing were a series of symbols, strange and unfamiliar. They looked ancient, almost like runes, and they seemed to radiate a dark energy that made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch them, but the figure stopped me. "Don't," it warned, its voice sharp. "Those symbols are dangerous. They're a ward meant to keep something out. Or keep something in," I whispered, my eyes widening in realization. The figure nodded slowly. "Perhaps. Either way, we shouldn't disturb them." We stepped over the threshold and into the house. The air inside was even colder and more oppressive than outside. The scent of dust and decay was overwhelming, and the silence was deafening. The house was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon visible through the grimy windows. The figure led me through the house, past cobweb-draped furniture and peeling wallpaper. The house was exactly as I remembered it, but somehow more sinister, more haunted. I could feel Mrs. Ainsworth's presence growing stronger with each step, her energy swirling around me like a vortex. We finally stopped in front of a closed door at the end of the hallway. The figure turned to me, its shadowy face barely visible in the dim light. "This is it," it said. "This is where it happened." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It reached out and slowly opened the door. The room inside was small and cluttered, filled with old boxes and forgotten belongings. The air was thick with a musty odor, and the silence was almost unbearable. In the center of the room, bathed in the pale moonlight, was a small wooden box. I knew instantly that it was the box Mrs. Ainsworth had found, the box that contained the secrets of her past, the box that held the key to her torment. The figure spoke in a terrifying voice. "Open it," it commanded. "It's time to uncover the truth." I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to the box. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to unleash whatever darkness lay inside. But I knew I had no choice. I had to face the past, to confront the truth if I ever wanted to be free. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid of the box. Inside, I found a stack of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. And beneath the letters, a photograph. I picked up the photograph and held it to the light. What I saw made my blood run cold. The people in the picture looked familiar, but I can't put my finger on it. This seems like it happened a long time ago. What is going on here? What is going on here? The photograph was old, sepia-toned, and showed a group of people standing in front of the house. It was clearly taken decades ago, and as I looked closer I realized who they were. One of them was a younger version of Mrs. Ainsworth. Another was her sister Martha. And the third was me. Or at least someone who looked exactly like me. The resemblance was uncanny, like looking at a ghost of my past. I flipped the photo over, my hands trembling. On the back, someone had written a single word, always. The air in the room grew colder, and I could feel Mrs. Ainsworth's presence intensifying. I looked up at the shadowy figure, my mind reeling. Who is that? I asked, pointing to the person who looked like me. Why do I look like her? The figure didn't answer, its silence more terrifying than any words could have been. It simply gestured to the letters in the box. Read them, it whispered. They will tell you everything. I hesitated, then reached for the letters. The ribbon was brittle and broke as I untied it. The letters were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded with time. I opened the first one, my heart pounding in my chest. It was addressed to Eleanor from someone named Samuel. The writing was elegant and flowing, filled with flowery language and declarations of love. But as I read on, the tone of the letter shifted. Samuel wrote of a secret, a forbidden love, a pact they had made to be together forever. He wrote of a ritual, a ceremony that would bind their souls, ensuring their eternal devotion. But he also wrote of a sacrifice, a price that had to be paid to seal the pact. I opened the next letter, and the next, each one revealing more of the twisted story. Samuel was a dark figure, a charismatic but dangerous man who had manipulated Eleanor and Martha into a deadly game. He had convinced them that the ritual would bring them happiness, but it had only brought them pain and suffering. The sacrifice he demanded was not what they had expected, and the consequences had been devastating. As I read the letters, images flashed through my mind. A dark forest, a blood-soaked altar, a chanting figure, a terrified scream. I saw Eleanor and Martha, young and innocent, caught in Samuel's web of deceit. I saw the ritual, the sacrifice, the moment when everything went wrong. The final letter was written by Eleanor, just days before her death. It was filled with remorse and regret. She wrote of the curse that Samuel had unleashed, a curse that bound their souls to the house, trapping them in a cycle of torment. She wrote of her desperate attempts to break the curse, to free herself and her sister from Samuel's grasp. But she had failed. He tricked us, Eleanor wrote. He promised us eternal love, but he only brought us eternal pain. The house is cursed and we are trapped here forever. I can feel him watching us, waiting for us. He will never let us go. As I finished reading the letter, I understood everything. I understood why Mrs. Ainsworth was haunting me, why I looked like the woman in the photograph, why I was drawn to the house on Elm Street. I was part of the curse, a descendant of Eleanor or Martha, destined to repeat their tragic fate. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its presence looming over me. You are the key, it whispered. You are the one who can break the curse. But how? I asked, my voice trembling. How can I stop him? The figure reached into its pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It opened the locket, revealing a tiny portrait of Eleanor. This locket belonged to Eleanor, the figure said. It is the only thing that can protect you from Samuel's power. Wear it and it will guide you. I took the locket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. I felt a surge of energy coursing through me, a sense of hope in the midst of despair. I knew that I had a long and dangerous road ahead of me, but I was no longer alone. I had Eleanor's spirit to guide me, and the locket to protect me. As I put on the locket, the shadowy figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the darkness. Remember, it whispered as it disappeared. The truth lies in the past. Find Samuel's grave and destroy him forever. I was left alone in the room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The house was silent, but I could feel Samuel's presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. I knew that he would not make it easy for me. He would fight me every step of the way. But I was determined to break the curse, to free myself and Eleanor and Martha from his evil grasp. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the room, ready to face whatever horrors awaited me. I had a mission, a purpose, and I would not rest until I had destroyed Samuel and brought peace to the house on Elm Street. As I made my way to the front door, I heard a creaking sound from upstairs. This time I am not going to be a victim. I am going to take the fight to him. This time I am not going to be a victim. I am going to take the fight to him. Clutching Eleanor's locket, I cautiously made my way towards the staircase. Each step creaked ominously under my weight, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence of the house. The air grew colder as I ascended, a palpable sense of dread washing over me. I could feel Samuel's malevolent gaze fixed upon me, his presence a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening intently. The creaking had stopped, but I could still sense something lurking nearby. The hallway stretched out before me, shrouded in darkness, doors leading to unknown horrors lining either side. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of which way to go. Then, I noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath one of the doors. It was a sickly green light, pulsating with an unnatural energy that made my skin crawl. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The metal was cold and clammy to the touch, as if it had been touched by death itself. I took a deep breath and turned the knob, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was a horrifying sight. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones I had seen on the porch railing, but these were drawn in what looked like blood. The air was thick with the stench of decay and sulfur, a nauseating combination that made my stomach churn. In the center of the room, a circle had been drawn on the floor, filled with candles that cast an eerie green glow. And in the middle of the circle, a figure stood hunched over, chanting in a guttural language that I couldn't understand. It was Samuel. His face was gaunt and skeletal, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. His hair was long and matted, his clothes tattered and stained. He looked like a creature from a nightmare, a grotesque parody of a human being. He was completely absorbed in his ritual, oblivious to my presence. I knew that I had to stop him, that I couldn't let him continue his evil work. But I was terrified. I was just a normal person facing a powerful and malevolent entity. What could I possibly do? Then I remembered Eleanor's locket. I clutched it tightly in my hand, drawing strength from her spirit. I closed my eyes and focused all my energy on the locket, willing it to protect me, to guide me, to give me the power to defeat Samuel. When I opened my eyes, I felt different. I felt stronger, more confident, more determined. I knew that I could do this. I had to. I stepped into the room, my presence immediately breaking Samuel's concentration. He stopped chanting and turned to face me, his eyes widening in surprise and rage. "You," he hissed, his voice raspy and filled with venom. "How dare you interrupt my ritual?" "I'm here to stop you, Samuel," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You've caused enough pain and suffering. It's time for you to pay for your crimes." Samuel laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. "You think you can stop me? You're just a foolish mortal, a pawn in my game. You have no idea what I'm capable of." "I may not know everything," I said, "but I know that you're a monster, and I'm not afraid of you." I raised Eleanor's locket, holding it out towards Samuel. "This locket belonged to Eleanor," I said. "It's a symbol of her love and her strength, and it will protect me from your evil." Samuel's face contorted in rage as he saw the locket. "That wretched trinket," he screamed. "It has no power over me." He raised his hands, chanting once again in his guttural language. The candles flickered and flared, the green light intensifying. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel Samuel's power growing stronger. But the locket was also growing stronger. It began to glow with a soft, white light, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I could feel Eleanor's spirit surrounding me, filling me with courage and determination. "You can't win, Samuel," I said. "Eleanor's love is stronger than your hate. Her light will banish your darkness." I charged towards Samuel, holding the locket high. He screamed in fury and unleashed a wave of dark energy towards me. But the locket deflected the energy, sending it back towards Samuel. The dark energy struck Samuel, causing him to convulse and scream. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew cold, and I could feel Samuel's presence fading. When the darkness cleared, Samuel was gone. The room was empty, the only evidence of his presence the lingering stench of sulfur and the blood-stained symbols on the walls. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I had defeated Samuel. I had broken the curse. I had freed Eleanor and Martha from his evil grasp. The hardest part of this is, where is Samuel's grave? This is a big piece to the puzzle that I need to find. The hardest part of this is, where is Samuel's grave? This is a big piece to the puzzle that I need to find. With Samuel seemingly vanquished, at least for now, an eerie calm settled over the house, a stark contrast to the terrifying events that had just unfolded. Yet I knew this piece was fragile, incomplete. The final act required finding Samuel's physical remains and ensuring his true and utter destruction. But where to even begin searching? The house, with its myriad of hidden rooms and shadowed corners, felt like a labyrinth designed to conceal its darkest secrets. I decided to start my search in the room where I had confronted Samuel. Perhaps there were clues hidden amongst the ritualistic symbols or within the circle he had drawn. I carefully examined the walls, running my fingers over the blood-like markings, searching for any inscription or pattern that might point me towards his final resting place. The symbols themselves seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes, as if trying to conceal their true meaning. I felt a dizzying sensation, a pull towards the darkness that threatened to overwhelm me. I quickly stepped back, clutching Eleanor's locket for protection. Then I turned my attention to the circle on the floor. It was composed of a strange, powdery substance that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. As I knelt down to examine it more closely, I noticed a faint scent emanating from the powder, a mix of earth, decay, and something else, something acrid and metallic that made my nostrils burn. I carefully scooped up a small amount of the powder and held it up to the light. It was then that I saw it, tiny fragments of bone mixed in with the dust. My heart pounded in my chest. Could this be it? Could Samuel have ground up his own bones and used them in his ritual? It seemed insane, yet somehow perfectly in line with the twisted nature of the man. But if this was the case, where did he get the bones? Had he exhumed his own grave? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I needed to find out more about Samuel, about his life and his death. Perhaps there were old records or newspaper articles that could shed some light on his burial. I decided to head to the local library, hoping to uncover some clues in the town's historical archives. Leaving the house felt like escaping a suffocating nightmare. The fresh air filled my lungs, and the warmth of the morning sun on my skin was a welcome relief. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was still watching me, his malevolent presence lurking just beyond the shadows. As I drove into town, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, a nagging sense that I was being hunted. The library was a quiet, unassuming building, filled with the comforting scent of old books and paper. I approached the librarian, an elderly woman with a kind face and gentle eyes. I explained that I was researching local history and asked if she had any information about a man named Samuel. The librarian's face clouded over. "Samuel, you say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." He was a dark figure, a troubled man. They say he practiced strange rituals, delved into forbidden knowledge. She paused, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "He died many years ago, under mysterious circumstances. Some say he was murdered, others say he took his own life. His grave is in the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. But I wouldn't go there, dear. That place is cursed. It's best to leave the past buried." Despite her warning, I knew I had to go to the cemetery. It was the only lead I had, the only way to find Samuel's grave and put an end to his evil once and for all. I thanked the librarian for her help and headed towards the old cemetery, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. The cemetery was a desolate and overgrown place, filled with crumbling tombstones and gnarled ancient trees. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was broken only by the mournful cry of crows overhead. I wandered through the rows of graves, searching for Samuel's name, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. Finally, in a far corner of the cemetery I found it, a simple, unmarked headstone, half hidden beneath a tangle of weeds. I knelt down and cleared away the debris, revealing a name etched into the stone, Samuel. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was it. This was where Samuel's physical remains were buried. But something felt wrong. The grave felt empty, as if something had been disturbed. And then I saw it. A patch of freshly turned earth, hidden behind the headstone. Someone had been digging here recently. My blood ran cold. Had Samuel's body been exhumed? Was he still alive somehow? Or had someone else taken his remains for their own dark purposes? I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. I had a feeling I was not alone in the cemetery. And then I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. Only the crumbling tombstones and the gnarled trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of my fear and exhaustion. But deep down I knew it was something more. Something evil. Something that was very close. I need to quickly find a way to flee this place and find out what I am dealing with and not be a victim. I need to quickly find a way to flee this place and find out what I am dealing with and not be a victim. The whisper hung in the air, sending icy tendrils of fear snaking down my spine. I scanned the graveyard frantically, my eyes darting between the decaying monuments and overgrown shrubbery, desperate to find the source of the disembodied voice. Each shadow seemed to lengthen and twist, morphing into grotesque figures that danced at the periphery of my vision. The wind picked up, swirling fallen leaves around my feet like restless spirits, their rustling whispers adding to the cacophony of dread. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the cemetery and the unseen presence that stalked me. But I also knew that running blindly would be foolish. I needed to assess the situation, to understand what I was up against before making a move. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to remain calm. I focused my senses, listening for any further sounds, watching for any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A dark shape, half hidden behind a towering mausoleum. I slowly turned towards the mausoleum, my hand instinctively reaching for Eleanor's locket. As I moved, the dark shape shifted, revealing itself to be a figure cloaked in shadow. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a deep hood. It stood motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "What do you want?" The figure did not respond. It simply stood there, its silence more terrifying than any words could have been. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look at its face. But as I did, the figure glided silently behind the mausoleum, disappearing from view. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I follow it? Or should I run? My instincts told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But curiosity and a desperate need to understand what was happening kept me rooted to the spot. I cautiously approached the mausoleum, peering around the corner. The figure was gone. But as I looked around, I noticed something lying on the ground, a small, tarnished silver trowel, the kind used for gardening. It was caked in fresh dirt, the same dirt that I had seen on Samuel's grave. My mind raced. Could this figure have been the one who exhumed Samuel's body? Was it a follower of Samuel, someone who sought to resurrect him? Or was it something else entirely? I picked up the trowel, examining it closely. As I did, I noticed a faint inscription etched into the handle, a single word, Ainsworth. My blood ran cold. Ainsworth? As in Mrs. Ainsworth, the woman who had haunted the house on Elm Street? Was she somehow connected to Samuel? Was she the one who had exhumed his body? Suddenly, everything began to fall into place. Mrs. Ainsworth's obsession with the past, her strange behavior, her knowledge of the house's secrets, it all pointed to a deep connection to Samuel. But what was her motive? What did she want with his remains? I knew I had to find her, to confront her and demand answers. But I also knew that she was dangerous, that she possessed a knowledge and a power that I could barely comprehend. I left the cemetery, the trowel clutched tightly in my hand. As I drove back towards town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a web of darkness, a conspiracy that stretched back centuries. And I was beginning to suspect that I was not just a victim but a key player in this deadly game. My first stop was Mrs. Ainsworth's house. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. As I pulled up to the curb, I noticed that the house was dark and silent. The windows were boarded up and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned. I cautiously approached the front door, knocking loudly. There was no answer. I tried the door, but it was locked. I peered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, but I couldn't see anything inside. Mrs. Ainsworth was gone. But where? And why? Had she fled after exhuming Samuel's body? Or was she hiding, waiting for me to make my next move? I knew that I couldn't give up. I had to find Mrs. Ainsworth, to uncover her connection to Samuel and to stop whatever evil plan she was concocting. But I also knew that I was walking into a trap, that every step I took was bringing me closer to a darkness that threatened to consume me. I'm starting to wonder maybe the answers I needed is with Eleanor and Martha. The thought struck me like a bolt of lightning, a sudden realization that the key to unraveling this terrifying mystery might lie not in the physical world, but in the spectral realm, with the very spirits I had sought to liberate. Perhaps Eleanor and Martha, trapped for so long within the confines of the house, had witnessed things, had gleaned secrets that were now beyond my reach in the waking world. Perhaps they held the key to understanding Mrs. Ainsworth's motives, to deciphering Samuel's dark rituals, to ultimately vanquishing the evil that threatened to consume us all. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Communicating with the dead was a dangerous game, fraught with peril and uncertainty. But I was running out of options. I had exhausted all the conventional avenues of investigation, and I was no closer to understanding the true nature of the threat I faced. I decided to return to the house on Elm Street. It was a place of darkness and dread, but it was also the only place where I felt a connection to Eleanor and Martha. I hoped that by returning to their former prison, I could somehow reach out to them, to establish a connection and glean the information I so desperately needed. As I drove back to the house, the sky grew dark and ominous. A storm was brewing on the horizon, and the wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony of sound. The closer I got to Elm Street, the heavier the atmosphere became, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. When I arrived at the house, the storm was in full force. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rattled the foundations. The house seemed to groan and shudder as if it were alive and in pain. I stepped inside, the familiar chill enveloping me like a shroud. The house was even more desolate and foreboding than I remembered. The shadows seemed to deepen and twist, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and despair. I made my way to the parlor, the room where I had first encountered Eleanor's spirit. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and focused my thoughts on Eleanor and Martha. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "Martha, can you hear me? I need your help. I'm trying to stop Samuel, but I can't do it alone. Please, if you can hear me, give me a sign." I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence stretched on, broken only by the thunder and the rain. Just when I was about to give up hope, I felt a cold breeze brush against my face. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could feel a presence, a faint energy that wasn't my own. I opened my eyes and saw it. A faint, shimmering figure floating in the corner of the room. It was Eleanor. She looked pale and ethereal, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Eleanor," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "Is it really you?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "We are here," she whispered, her voice a faint echo in my mind. "We have been waiting for you." "I need your help," I said. "I'm trying to stop Samuel, but I don't know how. Mrs. Ainsworth has exhumed his body, and I don't know what she plans to do with it." Eleanor's face clouded over with anger. "Ainsworth," she hissed. "She is a servant of darkness, a pawn of Samuel's evil. She seeks to resurrect him, to unleash his power upon the world." "But why?" I asked. "What does she gain from it?" "She seeks power," Eleanor said. "She believes that by serving Samuel, she will gain immortality, eternal life. But she is mistaken. Samuel will only use her and then discard her like a broken toy. How can I stop her?" I asked. "How can I prevent Samuel's resurrection?" Eleanor paused, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "There is a way," she said. "But it is dangerous and it requires a great sacrifice." "What is it?" I asked. "I'll do anything." "You must find Samuel's grimoire," Eleanor said. "It is a book of dark magic, filled with his most powerful spells and rituals. It contains the key to his resurrection, and it also contains the key to his destruction." "Where can I find it?" I asked. "It is hidden," Eleanor said. "In a place where darkness dwells, where the veil between worlds is thin. A place that Mrs. Ainsworth frequents." Eleanor faded, a sign that she had told me all that she could. I stared at the spot where she had been, then glanced around at the house, trying to think of a place that fits that description. My body went cold as one particular part of the house sprang to mind. It was time for me to pay a visit to the house's most sinister location, the basement. The very thought sent a shiver down my spine. Even in broad daylight, the basement had always felt cold and oppressive, a place where shadows danced and unseen eyes watched. Now, with the storm raging outside and the house plunged into darkness, the prospect of descending into that abyss was almost unbearable. But I knew I had no choice. If Samuel's grimoire was hidden there, as Eleanor suggested, then I had to find it, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. The door was old and creaky, its hinges groaning in protest as I pulled it open. A gust of cold, damp air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of mildew and decay. I hesitated for a moment, peering into the darkness. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the earth. I started down the stairs, my hand gripping the railing tightly. Each step creaked ominously, echoing through the silence. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, and the scent of decay became almost overwhelming. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I swept the flashlight beam across the basement. It was a large, unfinished space with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. The ceiling was low and cobwebs hung like ghostly shrouds from the exposed pipes and beams. The basement was filled with junk, old furniture, broken appliances, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of the house's past. It was a chaotic jumble of discarded memories, a testament to the passage of time and the slow, inexorable march of decay. As I moved further into the basement, I started to notice strange symbols etched into the stone walls. They were the same symbols that I had seen in the room where Samuel had performed his rituals. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, as if they were imbued with some malevolent energy. I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the feeling persisted, a nagging sense that I was not alone in the basement. I continued my search, carefully examining every corner of the basement. I sifted through the piles of junk, opened dusty boxes, and peered behind stacks of old furniture. But I couldn't find anything that resembled a grimoire. Just when I was about to give up hope, I noticed something strange in the far corner of the basement. A section of the stone wall seemed to be slightly different from the rest. It was smoother and darker, and it didn't have any of the strange symbols etched into it. I approached the wall and ran my hand over its surface. As I did, I felt a faint vibration as if something was moving behind the wall. I pressed harder, and suddenly, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden chamber. I gasped in surprise. I had found it. A secret room hidden deep within the bowels of the house. I shone the flashlight into the chamber, revealing a small, circular room with stone walls and a dirt floor. In the center of the room there was a single wooden table. And on the table there was a book. The book was bound in black leather, and its pages were yellowed and brittle with age. It was covered in strange symbols and diagrams, and its very presence seemed to exude an aura of darkness and power. This had to be it. Samuel's grimoire. As I reached for the book, I heard a sound behind me. A soft footstep, followed by a whispered voice. Looking for something? I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing in the doorway of the secret chamber was Mrs. Ainsworth. She was dressed in a long black robe, and her face was pale and gaunt. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and her lips were curled into a sinister smile. "Mrs. Ainsworth," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "But I think I already know the answer. You're here for the grimoire, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "I know about Samuel. I know about your plan to resurrect him." Mrs. Ainsworth laughed. "You know nothing," she said. "You have no idea of the power that Samuel possesses. Once he is resurrected, he will rule the world, and I will be at his side." "You're insane," I said. "Samuel is evil. He will destroy everything." "Silence," Mrs. Ainsworth screamed. "You cannot stop me. Samuel will be resurrected, and you will be the first to feel his wrath." Mrs. Ainsworth raised her hand, and suddenly the room began to shake. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I felt a surge of dark energy, a palpable sense of evil that threatened to overwhelm me. She started to chant, and the symbols on the wall glowed red. It was now or never. I had to stop her before she completed the ritual and unleashed Samuel's evil upon the world. But how? I had no weapons, no magical powers, nothing but my own wits and determination. Thinking fast, I remembered the trowel I had picked up at the graveyard, the trowel with the inscription Ainsworth. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I had. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the trowel, and charged at Mrs. Ainsworth. She didn't see me coming. She was too focused on her chanting, too consumed by the dark energy that was swirling around her. I lunged at her, raising the trowel above my head. "This is for Eleanor and Martha." I yelled and brought the trowel down with all my might. The trowel struck Mrs. Ainsworth in the back of the head. She screamed, a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the basement. Her chanting stopped abruptly, and the symbols on the wall flickered and died. Mrs. Ainsworth stumbled forward, clutching her head. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with rage. "You fool," she hissed. "You don't know what you've done." She lunged at me, her fingers outstretched like claws. I dodged her attack and kicked her in the stomach. She doubled over, gasping for air. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the grimoire from the table and ran out of the secret chamber, back into the main part of the basement. Mrs. Ainsworth staggered after me, her face contorted with fury. "Give me back the grimoire," she screamed. "It belongs to Samuel." I ignored her and continued running back towards the stairs. I knew I had to get out of the basement, to get away from Mrs. Ainsworth and the dark energy that was permeating the house. As I reached the stairs, Mrs. Ainsworth grabbed my leg, pulling me to the ground. I fell hard, the grimoire flying out of my hands. It landed on the floor a few feet away. Mrs. Ainsworth crawled towards me, her eyes burning with hatred. She reached for my throat, her fingers tightening around my neck. I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring. Just when I thought it was over, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A faint, shimmering figure floating towards us. It was Eleanor. Eleanor lunged at Mrs. Ainsworth, her ethereal form passing through her body. Mrs. Ainsworth screamed again, a sound of pure terror. She released her grip on my neck and recoiled, clutching her chest. Eleanor continued to attack, her spectral hands tearing at Mrs. Ainsworth's flesh. Mrs. Ainsworth thrashed and screamed, her body writhing in agony. Then, with a final desperate gasp, she collapsed to the ground, lifeless. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, my body trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had survived. I had defeated Mrs. Ainsworth. And I had the grimoire. But the battle wasn't over yet. Samuel was still out there, his evil waiting to be unleashed. I knew I had to find a way to destroy the grimoire, to prevent him from ever being resurrected. I stood up, retrieved the grimoire, and stumbled out of the basement. As I emerged from the house, the storm began to subside. The clouds parted, and a ray of sunlight pierced through the darkness. It was a sign, I thought. A sign that hope still remained. I knew what I had to do. I had to find a way to destroy the grimoire, to banish Samuel's evil forever. And I knew just the place to do it. The graveyard where it all began. I drove back to the graveyard, the grimoire clutched tightly in my hand. As I walked through the tombstones, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that I was finally on the right path. I reached Samuel's grave, the place where Mrs. Ainsworth had exhumed his body. I stood there for a moment, contemplating the gravity of what I was about to do. Then I opened the grimoire. As I read the words, the symbols began to glow, and the air around me crackled with energy. I recited the incantation, the words of banishment, the words that would send Samuel back to the darkness from whence he came. As I finished the incantation, a blinding light erupted from the grimoire. The ground shook and the sky turned black. A vortex of energy swirled above Samuel's grave, sucking in the grimoire and everything around it. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light faded, the ground stopped shaking, and the sky returned to normal. The grimoire was gone, vanished without a trace. I stood there, panting, my body exhausted but my spirit renewed. I had done it. I had destroyed the grimoire, and I had banished Samuel's evil forever. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice. A faint, whispery voice calling my name. "Thank you," the voice said. "You have freed us." I looked around and saw Eleanor and Martha standing side by side, their faces radiant with joy. "You're free," I said, my voice choked with emotion. Eleanor and Martha nodded. "Yes," they said. "We are finally free. Thank you." They smiled at me, then faded away, disappearing into the light. I stood there for a long moment, watching them go. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the graveyard behind me. I had faced my fears, I had confronted evil, and I had emerged victorious. And in the process, I had freed 2 trapped souls and saved the world from a terrible fate. My nightmare was finally over. I stood there for a long moment, watching them go. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the graveyard behind me. The air felt lighter, the world brighter. The weight that had been pressing down on me for so long had finally lifted. I had faced my fears, confronted pure evil, and somehow, against all odds, I had emerged victorious. And in the process, I had freed 2 trapped souls and saved the world from a fate too terrible to imagine. My nightmare was finally over, or so I desperately hoped. But as I walked away from that cursed graveyard, a seed of doubt began to sprout in the back of my mind. Could it truly be finished? Was it possible to completely eradicate such darkness, to ensure that it never resurfaced? The thought gnawed at me, a persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went back to work, spent time with friends, and attempted to put the horrors of Elm Street behind me. But the memories lingered, like shadows clinging to the edges of my mind. I would often find myself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of Mrs. Ainsworth's twisted smile and the malevolent energy that had pulsed through the house. One evening, as I was sitting in my living room reading a book, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or some small animal. But the scratching persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like someone scraping their fingernails against wood. A chill ran down my spine. The attic. I hadn't been up there since I moved into the house. It was a dark, dusty, and forgotten space, filled with old boxes and forgotten relics. The very thought of going up there filled me with dread. But the scratching wouldn't stop. It grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I knew I had to investigate, to put my fears aside and confront whatever was lurking in the darkness above. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic door. It was located in the hallway, hidden behind a bookshelf. I pulled the bookshelf aside, revealing the door. It was old and weathered, with a rusty lock and a layer of dust so thick that it obscured the wood grain. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. What if Samuel wasn't truly gone? What if the grimoire hadn't been completely destroyed? What if this was all just a cruel trick, a way to lure me back into the darkness? Taking a deep breath, I turned the doorknob and pulled the door open. A gust of stale, musty air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something indefinable but undeniably sinister. I stepped into the attic, shining the flashlight beam around the space. It was even worse than I had imagined. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains from the rafters. The floorboards creaked ominously under my feet, and the shadows seemed to dance and writhe in the corners of my vision. The attic was filled with old boxes, filled with forgotten memories. Old clothes, yellowed photographs, broken toys, and dusty books. It was a chaotic jumble of discarded objects, a testament to the passage of time and the inevitable decay of all things. As I moved further into the attic, the scratching sound grew louder. It was coming from the far corner of the room, from behind a stack of old trunks. I approached the trunks cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the trunks and slowly began to move them aside. As I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Etched into the wooden floorboards, in what appeared to be fresh blood, were the same strange symbols that I had seen in Samuel's ritual room. And then I saw it. In the center of the symbols there was a small, black book. It was bound in leather, and its pages were yellowed and brittle with age. It looked exactly like the grimoire that I had destroyed. But that was impossible. I had seen the grimoire consumed by the vortex of energy, banished from this world forever. How could it be here in my attic waiting for me? As I stared at the book, it began to tremble. The symbols on its cover glowed with a faint, red light. And then I heard a voice. A familiar voice whispering my name. "You thought you had won," the voice said. "But you were wrong. I am eternal. I am darkness. And I will always return." The book floated into the air, opened itself, and began to recite the incantation, the words of resurrection. A wave of dark energy washed over me, and I felt myself falling to my knees. Samuel was back. And this time there was no escape.